New York Environmental Justice Alliance. He's also the sort of chair of the host committee, the New York.
Oh no, don't say that. No, I don't want that kind of responsibility.
Oh, all right. Well, let's just say a leading figure in the host committee, which is pulling together all the organizations that are trying to work on preparing for this demonstration.
So I work with the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. We're a citywide coalition of community-based organizations from the neighborhoods that are the most environmentally overburdened, from the South Bronx to North Brooklyn, Sunset Park to West Harlem, Morningside Heights. And the reason why we're joining the People's Climate March is because we've got no choice. We all know that climate change is going to affect everyone, but we also know that climate change and the impacts from climate change are not going to be felt evenly. Our exposure, no pun intended, to climate change predates Sandy, predates Irene, predates the 2 tornadoes that hit Brooklyn within 4 years, predates multiple microbursts, predates countless nor'easters. You got to go back actually to the 90s. What happened in the late 90s was New York City updated its coastal zone management plan, something called the Waterfront Revitalization Program. The coastal zone management plan essentially breaks, and every waterfront city has these. It's basically assigns what uses are allowed along different parts of the waterfront. And there are like 4 categories. There's the natural waterfront, which we actually still have some in New York. There's the recreational waterfront. There is the redeveloping waterfront, which is a euphemism for the luxury housing waterfront. And then there's the industrial waterfront. Our community-based organizations all come from these communities that have, and it drives me nuts whenever I hear anybody talk about post-industrial New York, as if there are thousands of manufacturing jobs that are in fact rebounding. That, you know, I think part of the problem is that people look at manufacturing in this very dated sense, but you know, literally tens of thousands of New Yorkers rely on manufacturing, light manufacturing, industrial jobs, and thankfully so, because in this town, you know, we need to have some place where working people could still get livable jobs. It can't all be retail and service jobs. So we actually see ourselves as industrial retention advocates. But by the same token, we don't buy into this old paradigm. It's either the environment or economic development. We insist on both. Our communities are the communities that have the city's waste transfer stations, sewage plants, brownfields, power plants. Basically all the polluting infrastructure of the cities are concentrated in our communities. There was a designation that was added in the late 90s called significant maritime and industrial areas, which actually lowered some of the environmental protections that even industrial communities had. There are other industrial neighborhoods in the city, but this was like a special new category of screwing communities over called significant maritime industrial areas. So our challenge was to try to figure out how do we retain the industrial designation for our communities, but not totally wave the white flag when it comes to environmental protections. And so we tried in the closing days of the coastal zone management plan reform process to insert our reform recommendations, but those of you who are longtime New Yorkers will remember who was running New York City in the late 90s. And the Giuliani administration, about the only thing that they were more hostile to than environmental protection was civil rights. And you combined the two and we were just dead in the water. But now what we have in 2010 that we didn't have in the 90s was the climate change lens. And we now had climate change and adaptation tools in our toolbox. And so what we started doing is we started to do GIS mapping, Geographic Information Systems mapping, and looking at where these 6 significant maritime industrial areas were. And for what it's worth, they are the South Bronx, Newtown Creek, Brooklyn Navy Yard, Red Hook, Sunset Park, and North Shore of Staten Island. So how do we grapple with some of these reform recommendations? But now what we had were storm surge projections from the New York State Office of Emergency Management. And we started mapping those over the SMIAs. And of course now, you know, I guess it's no surprise to anyone, but in 2010 we were kind of like frozen in our tracks, shocked, and realized every single one of these SMIs were vulnerable to storm surges. And I'm not even talking about category 1 hurricanes. I'm talking nor'easters, you know, a stiff wind. Our neighborhoods were now. And so from our perspective, what does this mean when you have clustered, you know, hundreds if not thousands of industrial uses, toxic chemicals? What does it mean when you have all this stuff now in the path of storm surges, as if our air quality and our soil and other kind of public health and environmental impacts weren't enough? What does this mean when the East River swoops through your neighborhood collecting these kind of toxic pools? So what we started doing was looking at all the publicly available databases, and we started looking at what all the Environmental Protection Agency permitted sites, what were the DEC, the State Environmental Agency, DEP, and then we started seeing that there were all kinds of, you know, really heavy chemicals, everything from benzene to what's the other one? TCDs. There are literally like hundreds of chemicals associated. Again, not that these are guys doing this in any nefarious ways. These are like printers. These are people working, you know, on furniture stuff. These are not people doing bad things, but these are not people that built their businesses on the waterfront expecting, you know, Buttermilk Channel to come racing through their place of business, right? And so, and again, New York is not unique with this. Every industrial city in, forget the United States, in the world has this dynamic, right? This notion of luxury housing on the waterfront, that's a relatively recent phenomenon in urban history, right? It's only been in the last 50, 60 years that you're talking about luxury housing on the waterfront. For most of urbanized human history, the waterfront was where you put all your nastiest stuff. It's where you put all your heaviest manufacturing. It's where you put your people of color. All the kinds of stuff that you didn't want to deal with as a society, your immigrants, that's what ended up on the waterfront. So it was no coincidence that these neighborhoods had the heaviest industrial uses were also the neighborhoods that have some of the highest concentrations of people of color and immigrants. So we started doing this mapping and started coming up with a bunch of reform recommendations. And then, you know, again, this is now 4 years before Sandy. When Sandy hits, now we again have, you know, hard data that shows the disproportionality of impacts, right? One of the things that we found, again, when Sandy hit, most people now know that it was, you know, the South Shore of Staten Island, South Brooklyn, the Rockaways, Coney Island, and the Lower East Side. So people don't readily immediately think, well, industrial neighborhoods were not hit, it was okay. And that's not in fact true. One of the things that we found, the mayor's office has confirmed this, that of the of the businesses on the Brooklyn and Queens waterfront, half of them, about 800 businesses were industrial businesses that were impacted by Sandy. And nobody really knows. I know because we did a FOIL request, we found that there was a spill at a power plant maybe 6, 7 blocks from my offices. We don't know how bad, and this is one of those kind of like really nasty secrets about this stuff. One of the things that, had we known this before Sandy, we would have done what they call baseline testing. We would have tested the the soil around some of these industrial areas, so then we could do some post-Sandy testing and see how much possible contamination might have ensued from Sandy. Because as professional testers told us afterwards, we don't know, just because we show testing after Sandy that your neighborhood was contaminated, doesn't mean that the contamination wasn't there before, right? So that's the kind of incredible reality we've got to deal with. We've got to do pre-event testing just so we could show, yeah, we were polluted and things were not well in our community before, but this is how much worse it is after the event. So we, you know, of course, we didn't have the benefit of that kind of testing. But you know, some of the other statistics, again, forgetting about the industrial neighborhoods, if you look at the income statistics, so over 64% of all the renters that were impacted by Sandy in New York City, and not just the renters, over 28% of owners that were impacted by Sandy had household median incomes, annual median incomes of less than $30,000 a year. So, you know, again, that's not, you know, outside of New York, people might think, oh, we all know in New York, under $30,000 a year is poverty level. That's just not, you know, for a family of 4 or 5 or 1 or 2, it's not. So those are people who are renters and owners, right? If you look at public housing, over 20% of all public housing properties were affected, meaning over 35,000 units in over 402 buildings were impacted by Sandy. If you look at going back for a second for the industrial neighborhoods, if you look at the potential exposures in terms of these neighborhoods that are in and around, and that's one of the other things I've always got to remind folks, is that just because your neighborhood is zoned industrial does not mean that, especially in the densest city in the United States, that there's some like neat segregation between your industrial uses and your people. We live in and around these industrial areas, right? So for example, if you look at the number of New Yorkers that live within a half a mile of these 6 SMIAs, it's over 630,000 people. It's about the population of Washington, D.C., that lives in and around these significant maritime industrial areas. If you look at the percentage of people of color, it's over 433,000. So obviously a clear majority of people of color. color are disproportionately impacted, similar numbers for income. So when 3 months ago, we first get calls, first from our friends at something called the Climate Justice Alliance, which is similarly situated community groups from across the U.S. in the Southwest, West Coast, Midwest, that have been, grappling with the issue of climate change for years, of which we're a member, reached out to us and they said, the UN Secretary General is having this one-day summit in September where he's going to try and jumpstart talks for, was it Lima and Paris? Is that the order?
Lima in late November, early December this year, and then Paris a year later, end of 2015.
Right. So when we get this call, and by the way, our members have not been the kind of folks that have been participating in these world kind of gatherings. But when our friends from different parts of the country said, it's coming your way, we have to do something about this. And then literally within 2 days I get an email from 350 about a meeting they're pulling together. We realized we gotta march, we've gotta do something. We can't just continue the same, what's that old definition of madness? Keep doing the same thing over and over and expect a different outcome. From our perspective, it's not just that we saw it firsthand. It's not just that New York is the second or third most vulnerable city in the United States in a loser's race between us, New Orleans, and Miami. It's not just that. It's just that people from all across the country and the world need to work with us because they know that this is coming. This People's Climate March is coming. We had a meeting 2 months ago where the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance came and talked about how we need to mobilize for this. The People's Climate March is, we know there's going to be all kinds of extracurricular activities before, during, and after. The intent for the march is we need this to be family friendly. Everybody has to come to this. This is not one that people can sit out anymore. We cannot. It's 2 months before the midterm elections, if you want to get political about it. We've got to make this a moment when, and it's happened repeatedly throughout our history. In the 30s and the 40s, labor marched, we got Social Security and Medicare out of it, or Medicaid, I was getting those confused. In the 60s, they marched and we got the voting rights and the civil rights side. In the 80s, they marched, and believe it or not, they even got the Reagan White House to do something about nuclear proliferation. We can no longer, there comes a time when mass movements have to deliver the kind of message that individual struggles throughout the world can no longer do. Because we want to do the largest climate march in US history. What was it, 60,000, May? Is that the number we got to beat now?
Oh, it's a little more.
So
100,
for
more than 100.
So for those obnoxiously competitive New Yorkers among us, you know that this is a number we can top and we must. And if we will, blocks, because the idea is we're still negotiating with the police department. And what's interesting is that usually for these mass marches, if those of you who did, the stop and frisk march, that we didn't, Times Square was that, and the anti-war marches 10 years ago, Times Square is like verboten for the police department, right? When we told them that not only must we, but we will march through Times Square, we were not shut down, which is a great sign, right? There are a couple of potentially different routes. I think that the route that we're all, for now, most pushing, will start just a few blocks from here. Columbus Circle. This is where, thank God, we have friends like 350 where they're all over the place, because if we can pull this off, maybe simultaneous protests can happen in other parts of the world and they could be live streamed around some of those screens around 42nd Street, so that we're clearly connecting globally, right? So you don't have to, waste jet fuel coming to New York. You can do it in your own town. I think maybe even the police realize that some of them live in a world that they may be, either marching or swimming themselves in a decade or two, right? So all I can tell you guys is that our intention is to have that kind of march, a march where everybody shows up, a march where you may not know what fossil fuels are from greenhouse gases, and it doesn't matter. You just know that your family and your future are at risk, and if you don't show up now, then don't cry in 5 years when it hits again. And the greatest irony of all is that we're expecting one of the worst hurricane seasons predicted this year. So if that's not enough incentive, I don't know what is. I'll stop there.